joining today. Hey, recording in progress. I want to say, Julie, thank you for joining today, as I believe this may be the only Holocaust session this year. So that's like super exciting that I have so many people interested in learning more about this topic and its relationship to human rights in the 21st century. I have a presentation for you that I'm going to go ahead and share and start, but I do want to say I did create a meetup group for 4:15 today, kind of like meet me in the parking lot type thing at the end of the day, so that if you have any questions that we ran out of time and you weren't really able to ask or whatever, we can hang out there and you can go ahead and get those questions answered without feeling like you have to rush to another session. Okay. All right, let me.
Will we have access to this PowerPoint after your session?
Yeah, make sure I have my email on the presentation, and I would say email me to be sure, and I will send you this as well as a bunch of other resources as well. Okay. Let me see here. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Awesome. Okay, I see the thumbs up. That's good. Just like in class. Okay, so here we go. My name is Carolina Simon, and my organization is Zachor Shoah. I am the founder and educational director of it. I've been a little bit about me. I've been teaching since 1999. I've taught language arts, social studies, and Holocaust studies in the state of Florida, as well as California. I have an MA from UT Dallas in humanities with a focus on Holocaust and ethnic literature. So I did a lot of mostly African-American literature in that ethnic studies. I have taught all the grades from 6th grade through college. And I started this organization back in 2018 because after having gone to various workshops myself, I saw that there was a gap in what was being presented. I felt that a lot of teachers who didn't have as much background knowledge as I had were missing out on that. The organizations are presenting some fabulous things, but they're coming in kind of patchwork. And that left a lot of my colleagues a little bit kind of in limbo. So I wanted to help out with that. I did write a textbook that is available to anyone interested, specifically for grades 6 through 12 on Holocaust and human rights. And much of the presentation today does take those concepts into it, okay? And the pictures here, some of them are projects and activities that I've done with my students. And that is a picture of myself and Zuzana Ashvat. She is a Holocaust survivor, a professor at UT Dallas, my mentor, one of the founding people for the Holocaust Museum in DC and the one in Dallas. So today's agenda, we're just going to do a brief history on the Holocaust and Holocaust education. We're going to focus on the importance of the Weimar Republic,
I could be anywhere.
prior to the Nazis. And therefore, we're going to be looking at the importance of teaching democratic values in relation to the Holocaust and its connection through an interdisciplinary scope, predominantly language arts, history, and art. Okay, so I have our objective, our I can statement, right? So by the end of today, you all will understand what is meant by going beyond Auschwitz, how democratic values and valuing individualism helps prevent genocide, and how interdisciplinary project-based teaching helps students better understand this subject. And your assessment is going to be that you're going to be able to write your own interdisciplinary project-based lesson for the Holocaust. Does anybody know what those little squares are at the top? If you do, raise your hand. No, those are called Stapelsteins, and they are brass plaques on the side of the street now they are in Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Spain. It's a art piece, that's an installation art piece throughout Europe. And it's actually quite controversial. They do have the names of people who, mostly people who were murdered during the Holocaust. A handful of them did survive, but they're placed outside the places where they once lived. And in the old Jewish quarters, it's like the road, the street just looks like it's made of gold. It just glistens. And it gives people like this eerie feeling of, oh, wait, what took place here? That you can't really walk through and ignore. And so that's a.
It's you show you how to do it.
Yes. Sorry?
Is
that a question or just we just don't have? Okay. So we have our Holocaust mandate for the state of Florida in the event that you don't know it. The history of the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945, is the systemic planned annihilation of European Jews and other groups by Nazi Germany, a watershed event in the history of humanity, to be taught in a manner that leads to an investigation of human behavior and understanding of the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping, and an examination of what it means to be a responsible and respectful person for the purposes of encouraging tolerance of diversity in a pluralistic society, for nurturing and protecting those democratic values and institutions that I mentioned earlier. And I have this, I guess it's a poster. I found it online some time ago, and it really spoke to me in relation to our Florida Holocaust mandate. Because it says, education is not memorizing that Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Education is understanding how millions of ordinary Germans were convinced that it was required. Education is learning how to spot the signs of history repeating itself. And I think that's an important distinction, because we can teach facts, and that's important. But if we don't teach children the context of those facts, then it's for naught, right? I actually had someone tell me the other day that, you know, we need to not worry about that so much. And I said, well, then that's implying that the Holocaust was such a unique event to such unique people that it can really never happen again. And if it can never happen again, then why bother studying it? So it is within that framework that we should consider when we are, you know, keep that very cognizant in our minds as educators when we're looking at this subject. So you may or may not realize this, but the Schindler's List, the film Schindler's List, came out about 30 years ago, I think 28 to be exact. And that's really what catapulted Holocaust education onto the scene throughout the country. It had started a few years prior in California. I think California had a mandate that started in 1986, but it was all alone in there for quite a while. And then, you know, we have Schindler's List, and it really put it at the forefront of everyone's minds. And yet, almost 30 years later, 2/3 of young people under the age of 30 do not know what the Holocaust was, do not know what the word Auschwitz is, do not know that 6 million Jews were murdered. They have no concept of this. How is this possible that we have almost 30 years of a mandated educational program, and yet we have so many young people who still don't know what this is? So that is part of my organization's intent. My personal intent is helping to change this one classroom at a time. And I believe we start by going beyond Auschwitz. So here's your essential question. I did, as you can see, this was actually written on my class board, on my classroom board last year, actually. It says, race is a social construct. How has its popularity as a social and scientific norm affected the 21st century? So let that mull over in your mind for a minute, and you can put your responses to it, feel free, in the chat, okay? For students, and I think probably for most people, the thing that really just jumps out at them immediately with this essential question is the idea of race is a social construct. And so you have to sometimes break that down for students. What does that mean? What is a social construct, right? the word construct, construction. It was created, it was built by what? By society. For what purpose? Right? And that's what takes us into some greater thoughts. And we're gonna keep that idea in your head, because we're gonna come back to that in a few slides from now. So here are some undeniable facts about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Europe had a 1,000-year-long history of anti-Semitism by the time that Hitler appeared on the political scene. So this idea that Hitler, created the level of anti-Semitism that existed in Germany at the time is a falsehood, right? They had a long-standing history of anti-Semitism. It was to the point that it had become a deep-rooted cultural norm by the time that Hitler becomes political. Much of that was created and promoted by the Catholic and Christian churches of Europe. I did post an article to the conference site that talks a little bit more about this. Fascism was embraced by many European nations. It was not unique to Germany. It was invented by the Italians under Mussolini, and Italy, Spain, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, not just Germany. Many, many nations had fascism at that time. Germans were the only ones to call it Nazism. Nazism is unique in that it was a race-based fascism, but all of these nations had fascism. And then you had some other countries in Europe at the time that had either communism or some other kind of theocratic totalitarian government. So places like Russia and Turkey, for example. So this idea of, where did democracy go? Well, democracy really wasn't a very well-known or well-understood concept in Europe at this time. France and UK were the exception to that rule. The rest of them really did live within totalitarian, spaces. So in many ways, the Holocaust was the culmination of nearly 500 years of industrialization, globalization, and urbanization's effects on society and human development. This becomes an aggravated truth when you have the Victorian era and the rise of the factory from the mid to early 1800s, which affects human worth. Which attributed various external conditions from race to cleanliness. The Victorians believed cleanliness was next to godliness, and that created an entire class system for them, not so different from eugenics. They actually employed a lot of that within that concept of cleanliness is next to godliness. And of course, the lower classes were physically unable to maintain that level. So this idea always put the most productive, or what they considered most productive people within society, as benefiting from this definition, and with individuals and their human value, their spiritual value at the losing end. And ultimately, the Holocaust becomes the industrialization of death. Auschwitz is a factory for death, for murder. So it is this, it's like you take all the negative things that could possibly come from industrialization and the, not seeing individuals and not seeing human value from an individual perspective, and just seeing productivity and growth from a productive perspective as all that matters. And you end up with this perfect storm of Auschwitz. By the end of the Holocaust in 1945, you have 6 million Jews and 5 million other quote unquote undesirables that had been murdered in either ghettos or concentration camps, with 1.5 million of them being Jewish children, most of them under the age of 10. Many more died after liberation, but those deaths were not actually counted towards that total number as being murdered by the Nazis, because technically they died post-Nazi era. So they weren't really counted in that number. If they had been counted in that number, the number would have been much higher. So for example, you have people at Bergen-Belsen who died of diphtheria, but they died maybe like 5 days after liberation. And so technically they died liberated and not during the Holocaust as a result of that statistic. In recent years, you have people like Father Dubois from France, who is the author of Holocaust by Bullets. He has devoted himself to unearthing mass graves throughout Eastern Europe and has found nearly 1 million more Jewish remains that had not been counted towards that number of 6 million, right? So really the number is greater than that, but it falls under those nuanced technicalities of if it's going to get counted or not. These mass graves become a testament to the role that anti-Semitism played in the involvement of everyday people, as opposed to that fervent ideology that was held by the Nazis and particularly the SS. So, many people believe that you could only have participated in this atrocity if you were this ideological psychopath. And that's not true. Those were the people who participated in the politics of it. Those were the people who wanted to have, they wanted to be in the SS, for example. But there were lots of people that participated either by turning a blind eye or actually physically assisting, but they didn't like the Nazis. They didn't believe in Nazism. They just believed in anti-Semitism. So, anti-Semitism and Nazism were able to work hand in hand in that way because they both were seeking the same goal. So we ask ourselves, how can a society, any society, get to this point? Well, we're going to look at 3 main points today. We're going to look at the Shoah, also referred to as the Holocaust, and it is recognized as the 12 years that Hitler and the Nazis were in power from 1933 to 1945. And we're going to look at some fundamental facts and some common myths as well. And we're going to look at why we call the Holocaust a watershed event in human history. We're also going to look at the Weimar Republic and the democratic values. The Weimar Republic was that baby democracy in Germany post-World War I. The fall of imperialism in Europe was truly a very traumatic event for Germany. It did allow them to create a constitution with what would appear to be a democracy, but it did fall short. I once had students say that it looked like their constitution was written by people who wanted to look like they wanted a democracy, but really didn't want one. And when you read it, you kind of see it. It did provide for the most progressive society in the world. That's something people don't generally realize, that the Weimar Republic was the most progressive society in the world to date, but failed to address a lot of other aspects of what makes a society a society. For example, economic issues, some cultural shifts that proved to be very extreme in a very short period of time. And without that strong democratic value foundation, it proved to be too much. And then we're also going to look at the individual. I have a quote here by Ayn Rand. She said, the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. As Ayn Rand's writings, whether it's her novels or her quotes or her philosophical writings, they always tend to focus on her deep regard for the individual and the complex understanding of what happens to a society when the individual is denied for the quote unquote greater good. And so these are the 3 main points that we're going to be focusing on today. So we're going to start with the Weimar Republic, actually, kind of chronological. Why the Weimar Republic matters? Well, let's look at economics. A stable economy not only allows for GDP growth, for example, it also allows individual growth. So as people are able to feel more secure, their anxiety diminishes and they're able to engage in, a broader range of leisure activities. This ultimately makes you a more robust, diverse person, and that makes for a more robust and diverse and educated society. An unstable economic situation creates the opposite. In the Weimar Republic, because of the Treaty of Versailles, as well as the Great Depression in the United States that created a domino effect throughout the world, really had probably the most unstable economy that the world has ever seen. People literally were burning Reichsmarks, their money, for fuel because it was worthless. It was just worthless paper. So at least they could stay warm with it. They were literally burning their furniture for it. These are people who were not living out in the middle of nowhere. They were in Berlin. So in the morning, you could afford, to buy bread with your money. And by the afternoon, it was nothing. It was pointless. So that created a very tense, unstable space. Politically, politics always go hand in hand with economics. So political stability and economic stability are always hand in hand. A stable government is able to create a stable economy, vice versa. Politics in the Weimar Republic were a blood sport. Literally, it was a blood sport. Every major political party had a paramilitary group. To Americans, this is generally such a foreign concept that your political party would have any kind of military operation. But this was common in this baby democracy of the Weimar Republic. They really didn't understand democracy at all when you understand that they all had their own paramilitary group. It's so bizarre to think this, but they did. By 1933, there were actually 52 different political parties on any given election ticket. Can you imagine having to decide between 52 different political parties? We have a hard enough time deciding between two. So, imagine what kind of, this was chaos. They lived in chaos. They had pockets of stability here and there where they were able to have that progressive society take hold. But for the most part, they lived in utter chaos. I provided two images of the two largest political parties at the time. There were three main political parties of those 52. You had the communist / social democrats. They were a very large party. You had the Nazis, who were not politically a large party. They didn't ever really get a lot of votes, but they had a very large presence, which is kind of odd, but they did. And then you had the Catholic / conservative party. They had, interestingly enough, their own paramilitary group as well. But the two that did the most action, they were always getting into it in the streets. And there are some videos on the Holocaust Memorial website where you can see what election day would look like in the Weimar Republic, where these two groups would actually go at it. The paramilitary group for the Nazis was called the Brown Shirts, and they're the picture in the middle in color. And the paramilitary group for the Social Democrats is in black and white, and they were the Antifascista, the Antifa. They're the original Antifa. So these two groups really had quite a day on the streets of Berlin prior to 1933. And then the last thing that matters about Weimar Republic is the social norms. World War I decimated an entire generation, either by killing them on the battlefields of Europe or maiming them. And therefore, most of the young people that remained post-World War I really felt like their world was coming to a complete end as they knew it. This put people into two different categories. Some of them felt very depressed and lost and desperate to reestablish what they fantasized about from their childhood. This is where most of the Nazis fall. And many others attempted to just completely rediscover themselves and reinvent life. And that's where all the non-Nazis fell. So, you know, again, all this instability economically, politically, culturally, you know, it just was this boiling point. And people really weren't paying attention to the right red flags, if you will. So I'm going to look, it's an extensive timeline. I'm not going to go through the entire timeline. I'm going to give this entire PowerPoint to you. So make sure you have, you know, that you provide your email to me so that I can do that. But I am going to just show you some key things. I do go all the way back to 1942. Because if you look at the thing, it's the timeline of events of human rights violations leading to and including the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust does not happen in a vacuum. It is the result of almost 500 years of human society continuously choosing to, at different points, violate human rights and leave that unchecked. And what that does to human development as a society when we do that, and then we think, hey, I can get away with that, or that was not such a bad thing. That's what happens. So I go all the way back to 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed that ocean blue, right? So he does, quote unquote, discover America, quote unquote, because it was already here. He just didn't know it, right? And this is the beginning of the ideas of globalization and immigration and industrialization, really, because there was a lot of scientific involvement in creating the technology to get them here and all of that, right? So with this new discovery, not only do those other things come along, but so does the classification of people from the point of race. So that idea, remember that essential question that we started with, that it's a social construct. Well, this is where it was constructed. That social construct was constructed in 1492, right? And it's, in Spanish, the word race is raza, and it literally means breed. So the Christopher Columbus and the Spaniards were looking at this as this is a different breed of people. For whatever reasons they had for saying that, that's what they were saying. And that got interpreted and translated and used in a variety of different ways in a variety of different places, right? But overall, it was a categorization of people based on desirability and less desirability, right? And it is ultimately the earliest form, the earliest stages of eugenics, this idea that genetically some of us are better than others, okay? And this is, you know, completely different from, it's not like the Europeans didn't have interaction with people that didn't look like them prior to that. They did. They've been trading with China. So this is different from the Silk Road and from that kind of concept, because this was not, they were not attempting to establish a relationship with the New World that was equal. They were not trying to establish a relationship that was based on trade. They were trying to establish a relationship that was entirely based on power. So that's, you know, why the Spaniards needed that classification to justify it, okay? So when you get this PowerPoint, I have it, as you can see, color coded. The red is the points in the history where it really comes out as it's not just a European thing, okay? It's throughout the world, things that took place that influenced the Nazis. The Nazis, the last thing they were was original. They took things from previous historical moments and adapted it to their own desires, their own agenda, okay? So starting with the social construct of race, all the way down to the Jim Crow laws, they really did, they literally quoted these laws when they were creating their own Nuremberg laws. So, and their point for doing that was they said, if a democracy like the United States has this on their laws, then clearly this is a justifiable legal action. So not that they didn't want to be a democracy. By that point, they had already removed democracy, but that was their justification for how why the world would be all right with what they were attempting to do. You have so, you're going to look at, when you get the PowerPoint, you'll be able to look through the history, for yourselves and notice that the red is really the parts that should be popping out at you, okay? I have from, in 1919, the end of World War I, you have the Treaty of Versailles signed and the Weimar Republic is born. But in September, so just a few months after this takes place, in September of 1919, Hitler issues his first written comment. He writes like an op-ed, his first written comment in a newspaper with the term, the Jewish question. So back in 1919, this is when people really should have been paying attention to that and saying, wait, what? But remember, they had that long history of anti-Semitism, and he's just putting into words things that they already kind of felt, and they're preoccupied with their economic and political instability. So they're not overly analyzing what he's doing. Okay, in that statement of the Jewish question, he actually defines the Jews as a race and not a religious community, making it an unchangeable characteristic, changing the way anti-Semitism was viewed in Europe up until that point. Because up until that point, they were like, just convert. And it characterized the effect of a Jewish presence as a race tuberculosis on the people, and identified the initial goal of a German government as being discriminatory legislation against Jews. The ultimate goal must definitely be the removal of the Jews altogether. So he's like 20-something years old at this time, and he's already saying, this is what any German government that comes in, including this newly formed baby democracy, this is what we should be doing. This is what we should be focusing on. And they can't change the way they are, and they're a disease. Okay, that's what he's saying. The following year, he creates the 25-point Nazi Party platform, okay, which again declares the intention of the Nazi Party to segregate Jews from quote unquote Aryan society and to abrogate Jews politically, legally, and civilly, so that they have no rights in any of those areas. So he's very clear. He's not hiding this at all, right? It's very obvious and very clear to anyone with eyes what he stands for and to what extent he stands for it, okay? A lot of people believe that Hitler was elected. He was not elected, okay? He was appointed Chancellor of the Weimar Republic in January 30th of 1933. The following month, there's a Reichstag fire. The Reichstag is like their Congress. There's a fire it was set by a young 20-something-year-old communist. It is believed by most scholars that he was kind of a patsy for the Nazis in that regard. The Nazis immediately claimed state of emergency, and their constitution had Article 48, which said that in an emergency, in a state of emergency, the chancellor and president together, they did have to do it in unison, could declare, that the Article 48 would be instated, which suspended all constitutional and civil rights indefinitely. Can you imagine if our Constitution had a clause in it that said that under states of emergency that are decided by the person in charge, that you no longer have any rights? I can't imagine our Constitution having that clause, but theirs did. So, and that was a major loophole that allowed Nazism to really take hold. So again, I'm going to show you, you'll be able to see just how fast these things happen too. Once the Nazis come in, once Hitler is the chancellor and they declare that Article 48 is instated, things happen very, very quickly. So when people say, well, why did they leave or why didn't they do something? Things happened very fast from that point on. So it really did require people to have, contingency plans before this would have ever come into play. And it required the regular German people who were not being persecuted to have a greater sense of community for their Jewish neighbors and to have spoken up much earlier than they ever did, those who did, right? So you'll see just how fast it all actually takes place and the kinds of things that they do, right? So for example, the first things that they put into law have nothing to do with the Jews. In July of 1933, it's this law that prevents hereditary diseases and forces people to be sterilized. That's a eugenics thing. The United States had a similar law. In November of that same year, it was a law against dangerous habitual criminals. Again, it meant that, if you had, it was kind of like our 3 strikes you're out rule. If you were considered a habitual criminal, then you were forever, you were put away forever. Like they didn't want to mess around with you anymore. But that was also founded on eugenics, this idea that you're genetically flawed because you keep committing crime. So, they had nothing to do with Jews. So in the beginning, okay, right? Then he goes after the Jehovah's Witnesses. He makes it so that it's illegal to be a Jehovah's Witness because Jehovah's Witnesses don't pledge allegiance to anyone or anything. So you had to pledge an allegiance to Hitler and they wouldn't do that. And so he outlawed their organization. He also went after the homosexuals. They already had a law against homosexuality in the Weimar Republic. As progressive as it was, it had a law against homosexuality, which was kind of a dormant law. It had been in existence prior, and they just never bothered with it. It's paragraph 175. And Hitler just actually put it into effect. And basically, the problem that Nazis had with the gay community was that they didn't procreate. And Hitler, one of his programs was baby factoring. So, he wanted to abolish and get rid of and kill off all the people that were undesirable and create a lot of desirable. And so he was very put off by the fact that these otherwise perfectly good Aryan people would not make Aryan babies. So that's what he predominantly had a problem with the gay community. And then you have the Nuremberg race laws that come in. And those, yes, are entirely anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish. But notice, that's not where he starts. He's testing the waters. He's testing the waters to see what will society accept and what will they not accept. And so very interestingly, in 1935, when he goes after gay people, instead of most people saying, hey, wait, my brother's gay or my neighbor's gay, you can't do this, to the contrary, they decide to, quote unquote, rat people out. You could literally call the Nazis and say, the guy across the street from me is gay because you didn't like the way they mowed their lawn. And they would get taken away. They would get taken to Dachau. There was no need for any kind of trial or proof or anything like that. And so people were literally, calling on people and claiming this on people just because they didn't like them. Maybe they got the job you wanted. Maybe they got the car you want, whatever it was. And they would be ousted and sent to Dachau over this. So the Nazis paid attention to that. They said, oh, look, people don't mind discrimination. They actually use it to their benefit. So that's when they then upped the ante and went to what they really had been wanting all along, right? So you'll be able to look at all these points. One last thing I want to look at on the timeline before we move on is the 2 examples of how people responded to being occupied by the Nazis. In Hungary, Hungary is occupied in March of 1944. The war ends in 45. Okay, Hungary is occupied in March of 1944, and in less than 3 months, nearly 500,000 people are murdered. This is almost the entire Hungarian Jewish population. This required a level of participation by the Hungarian people that was unprecedented anywhere else in Europe in the entire time that the Nazis were in power. By contrast, the Danish are occupied in 1940. The Germans liked the Danish. They felt, that they're Aryan on some level. The Danish didn't agree. From September of 1943 to October of 1943, this is when the Nazis actually decided they were going to start liquidating and transporting, quote unquote, the Jews out of Denmark, because between 1940 and 43, they kind of left them all alone, including the Jews, which actually allowed a lot of mainland Jewish refugees to come to Denmark. So you have from 1943 to September 1943 to October 1943, Danish citizens helped smuggle 7,200 Jews out of Denmark. This is nearly their entire Jewish population. It included 1,200 Danish Jews that were not Danish. They were refugees from Germany and other places, and 700 of their non-Jewish relatives to safety in Sweden. They were able to save all but 82 Jews. Okay, that contrast, the time period is very similar between Hungary and Denmark, the amount of time that it took, right? But the contrast between how Hungary responded and how Denmark responded. And neither time was it something that the government was saying you had to participate in. Both of them were personal choices. Their moral compasses, just one of them was pointing due north and the other one clearly was not, right? So I think that's a very important thing to notice about, how people responded to the Holocaust, because without their responses, the Holocaust might not have happened. It definitely wouldn't have been as successful or as in such a short period of time, right? It did require all these other people to be involved. So
Carolina, I hate to interrupt you, Carolina, because your information is so important and so valid in our world today. So can you give us a summary of your closing? We have another session starting in about less than 10 minutes.
And this is exactly why I
sorry.
created that. No, thank you. This is exactly why I created that meetup, because I knew that I would end up needing more time. I knew it. So I do have that meetup today at 4:15. I will be sending this email by email to you all right now as soon as we're done, so you can look at it and we can come back to the meetup and I can answer all your questions. You will see I have myths, I have all kinds of information about actual lessons, okay? A big project of mine that I did. I have pictures of previous projects and I have a little worksheet questionnaire for you, okay? So please, please, please make sure you email me. This is my email. Where is it? Oh, that's my website. Here's my email, okay? Please email me at zahorshoah@gmail.com. I will send this PowerPoint to you within the next 2 minutes. You can peruse it, look through it, and please meet me again today at 4:15 at the meetup so that I can, answer your questions, finish talking to you about all these ideas. If you want an additional meetup after that, I'm more than available. I did not realize our time.
Thank you so much, Carolina. What exciting information this is. And it's good to just kind of know what the history is behind all of this. Thank you so much.
The textbook that I wrote really does, it travels. It takes us on that human journey from 1492 through the Holocaust. Because the big question I always got was, why? And I could never answer that question with a simple 2-sentence answer. And so I think that we do that and we do it injustice to students when we
Yes.
oversimplify really ugly parts of history. So,
Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. We have 45 people in attendance. So thank
Wow.
you so much, Caroline.
is there a way for me to, in the event that they're not able to email me or they forget to email me, that I can get their email so I can just go ahead and send this to them?
Yes, I am going to give you their emails, and we have saved the chat.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so very much.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Again. Hi, Miss Mary.
Yes.
Hi, I'm here for the next presentation.
Yes, ma'am, but I have to close out this meeting and start the next one because I noticed that people were coming in. So I may bounce you out.
Okay, so I'm the presenter, so do I log back in?
Yes, you're gonna have to log back in.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm so sorry that it went over. I tried so
That's
hard to-
okay. No problem, Carolina. Thank you.